So when you have a small patient population, you exclude the same patients all the time, and you exclude any patient. And then the patients maybe that you don't exclude live in the Northwest Territories or in Northern BC who can't make it to the clinical trial site because you've only got 3 of them across Canada there, and they're all in the big cities. Then you're reducing a very small patient population by exclusion criteria and by location criteria. So, you start with a clinical trial that really sets the drug, I'm going to say up for failure, but it reduces the ability of the drug sponsor to prove how beneficial that treatment could be. And the way we get around that, I think, is real world evidence.
Hey everybody, I'm Costas.
And I'm Lester. Welcome to another episode of What's with RWE. Today we have another very special guest with us today. We have actually Joan. Joan did not want me to give her a big intro. She actually, one short line only actually. So she is a very, very enthusiastic patient advocate for the rare disease community. That's like how she wanted me to introduce her. So hi Joan, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, guys. Thanks for inviting me, and glad to be here. Hoping I can add something to the conversation about real-world evidence.
Great. Thanks a lot, Joan. And welcome back, Costas. Costas actually is a usual co-host, but he wasn't able to join us last podcast. So I hope you had a really good vacation.
Great time, and I'm glad that Susan was able to step in for me. I've had a sneak peek at the show, and I think you guys did a terrific job. But I may be able to just step away more often now and let you guys just take it on. But yeah, congrats for I think another good show that I think people will really enjoy.
Yes, I'm obviously looking forward to this conversation as well with Joan. But before we really go into the dig into sort of your story, Joan, I have to say I have to credit you with something, Joan. Thank you very much for motivating me to actually go potentially to a ballet. Actually, I'm going to opera for the first time ever. Primarily because in our last conversation with Joan and her daughters went to a ballet. So for my birthday, my wife actually bought me opera tickets.
Nice, very nice. So you're going to start to get more cultured. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, same building.
Exactly.
The ballet and the opera are in the same building. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But so Joan, I know you only wanted a one sentence sort of intro. So maybe you can give the audience just a little bit more background about yourself. You're a patient advocate, but you're also a parent of a loved one who's suffering from pulmonary arterial hypertension. So maybe you can give a little bit of background about who you are and your story and your journey to the point that you are right now as a patient advocate.
Sure. First of all, I just want to say, I don't know if you guys can see it, but I am wearing purple, and purple is the color of pulmonary arterial hypertension. It's the color of our community. The reason why it's the color of our community is because a couple of the symptoms of the disease are purple lips and purple fingertips, because oxygen doesn't flow to the extremities very well when you've got pulmonary arterial hypertension. But I'll start with just explaining why I'm an advocate. And that's because my daughter, who at the age of 24 was diagnosed with severe pulmonary arterial hypertension. That was 10 years ago, March of 2014. And prior to that, just to give you a perspective of how quickly her life changed. 3 years, for her whole entire life, from the time she was 5 years old until she was 21, she was a competitive figure skater. And she finished her career at the age of 21 being a national level figure skater who competed for Canada internationally. And so when she was in 2021, she was still skating. By 2024, she could barely climb a flight of stairs without fainting when he reached the landing at the top of the stairs. So it's a disease that can, in her case, progressed. I think it progresses really quickly, but I think there were underlying symptoms there for quite a while. We just didn't see them until they actually hit which is again not unusual for rare diseases and also not unusual for this disease. It can be misdiagnosed for years because of um, the fact that the symptoms, shortness of breath, chest pain, swelling of the ankles and feet, blue lips and stuff. Those kinds of symptoms are, they're not non-specific to any particular disease. And so, but let me explain as well what PAH is. First of all, pH is an umbrella term for a number of types of pH. World Health Organization has defined pH separated it in a pH into 5 different groups. 2 of those groups are rare. World Health Organization Group 1, and I think it's Group 5. Group 1 is PAH. Group 5 is CTEPH. So, and don't ask me what CTEPH stands for, but it is pulmonary embolisms. It's it's hard. it's a really long word, but it's basically pulmonary embolisms that reside in your lungs. There is no cure for PAH. Except CTEPH. There is surgery where they can remove the pulmonary embolism if it's in the bigger arteries. But if they're lower down in the lungs, there's no cure. It is a disease where the pulmonary arteries in your lungs constrict due to several factors that we're aware of currently. One is a over proliferation or proliferation of what they call the endothelial cells, which line the inside of the artery, making the inside narrower. A lack of nitric oxide. Patients with PAH don't produce as much nitric oxide as normal people do. And nitric oxide is also a vasodilator. And so with the lack of nitric oxide, one of our drugs actually is they're all vasodilators actually. But and the third one is a scarring and toughening of the actual wall lining of your arteries. And so between the scarring and the proliferation inside, you get a very narrow artery. And as that disease progresses, that narrowing becomes even narrower, and it makes your right ventricle work really, really hard. So patients don't actually die of PAH; they die of right ventricular heart failure. So it's a really complex disease. It's rare, misdiagnosed, and progressive and life-threatening. 2 other things I want to mention. If left untreated, the life expectancy is 2.8 years. And sometimes it takes patients up to 2 years to get diagnosed, which is why when my daughter was diagnosed, she was also severe. And currently, the treatments that we have currently allow patients to live longer. And technically, I mean, we consider patients to be long-term survivors if they're still living after 7 years after diagnosis. So at this present time, my daughter is considered a long-term survivor, but we are waiting for new medications because our community really does need different communications that worked on different mechanisms that actually might reverse the disease. Because nothing currently reverses the disease; it just slows the progression.
Thank you very much for the explanation. And this is the reason. Actually, maybe a little background story about how me and Joan actually met. Is we actually met at a conference, and I was having a conversation with Joan and Joe about real world data, and she was the first person ever that I've met that knew so much about real world data that isn't in the field. So here's again Joan being able to explain pulmonary arterial hypertension in a very, very detailed way, despite, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong here, you are not a scientist, right? You're not a science background.
Nope, just a mom. I do have a graduate degree, but it's in business, in finance. So yeah, science is the farthest thing. But I'm a very avid reader, and I really do. I'm very interested in like I just tend to do a lot of reading. It just happens to be that healthcare happens to be my read of choice for the last 10 years.
And just someone who's super passionate, very, very clearly. So, I mean, when you have passion, you can do almost anything. So, I appreciate that explanation. But may actually one thread that I want to pull on, primarily because we actually on a previous guest talked about this idea of a diagnostic odyssey. And she was Catalina in our last podcast. She has cancer, but that's a slightly different. That's different. And she said that her diagnosis made her understand just a little bit more about the diagnostic odyssey that rare disease patients go through. So, actually, do you mind educating, at least giving the audience a almost a glimpse into what that diagnostic odyssey looked like for your daughter?
Yeah, and I can. And actually, she was quite lucky. Like she was diagnosed with a rare disease at the age of 24. But it's incredible, really, when we look at where we are in relation to so many other patients, not only just in our community, but in the rare disease community, about where we live, about how quickly she was diagnosed. I mean, we live in just outside of Toronto, so we have access to the best hospitals in Canada. She was diagnosed really quickly. There are medicines to treat the disease. It doesn't cure it, like I said before, but it does slow the progression, which gives us time to actually hope for new medications that will reverse the disease. But I'll give you I'll explain how she was diagnosed. She literally she was walking down the street on the day I think it was the Vancouver the gold medal game of the men's hockey uh, day, February. I can't even remember the date, but it was February 2014. She literally stopped breathing. She couldn't. It was cold. It was really cold outside, and cold obviously restricts your breathing anyway. She literally. I mean, we always say, "Oh, I can't breathe," and she couldn't breathe. And so she does work at a hospital in Brampton, and she just figured she would go into the hospital and she would ask. She figured they would say if she had asthma and she'd get an inhaler. And when she went into the hospital, and she went into emergency, and they literally admitted her for 10 days onto the cardiac floor. So her diagnosis, but that's what I mean. We had seen stuff before. We just assumed it was because she wasn't as active and her cardiovascular system wasn't as good as it was when she was skating. And so she just needed to get back to the gym. We make excuses for a lot of things. So she was admitted to the cardiology floor for 10 days at Brampton Civic. That was the first time. It wasn't the first time I'd heard the words pulmonary arterial hypertension, because I had heard about the disease before, but it was the first. But what I remembered when I heard it that week was that it wasn't good. I knew it wasn't good. And we were basically told that at the time that her only hope was a double lung transplant at the time. And then it again, we were really lucky. I think maybe it was because she was so severe that it really only took 2 months to get an appointment with the PH clinic in the Toronto General Hospital. So she was really, really lucky. But we have patients that can wait like 6 years, 7 years. Asthma is a really big one. Women, PAH, the rare form of PH, affects women of childbearing age. That's the biggest cohort for this particular part of segment of the disease, the rare form of the disease. And it's really unfortunate because when women go to see their family doctor because they're feeling a shortness of breath, or they're having trouble, they're really tired, what they get usually is, "Oh, you're a new mom, so don't worry about it. It happens to everybody. It'll pass." And when it doesn't pass after a year or so, then they think they start looking at things like asthma and those kinds of things. So sometimes it takes a really long time to get diagnosed, and you can go from doctor to doctor too. Again, we were really lucky, and I'm just so appreciative of the fact that we were.
That's amazing. But it certainly speaks to not only the challenges for the diagnosis, but the challenges in developing any treatment to it, because it's rare. Clinicians don't see those patients, and then consequently, you don't have a large population to study and understand the disease, and then on top of that, figure out, well, how do we treat it, and then bring something to market. So what does that look like in your community?
First of all, I want to say that a lot of times rare diseases are gene specific. right? So it's understanding it is like, if you can find the gene, then, and you can find the patients, you might be able to find a treatment. It may be expensive, but you can find the treatment. The reason why I had said again that PAH it is a complex disease is because we already know that there are three pathways that are affected, or that we have medicines to treat. None of those pathways actually um, uh, reverse, and none of those. There are so many. I think there's almost maybe over 20 genes, proteins, whatever is out there that are implicated in the disease. And when you have that many things going on, it's even harder. To suggest that there could be a cure for PAH, I think is maybe a hope too far, because the disease is as complex as it is, and because there are so many different mechanisms that we don't understand and that seem to affect some patients differently than other patients. So, I mean, I think, we'd all like, every disease would like a cure, but I think we would like to, I think what I push for now is, rather than a cure, is really making understanding this disease well enough that it becomes a chronic disease, something that we have treatments for that can improve life beyond 7 years, I think, is where we're going. But yeah, to get to your point about how do you do that with rare disease populations, I think for me, the reality of it is we have to start with clinical trials. We have to understand that the way that randomized clinical trials are set up, they were set up or designed for common disease populations with a very large number of people. So you have a lot of people with the disease. You can find those people because they're everywhere, and then you can exclude a lot of people because you have so many people. So you exclude people from your trial because they might have these other issues that make them maybe not the best candidate, because the other things that are going on with them might actually um, uh, reduce the impact of the new treatment. And so you want to make sure that you're getting the best patients with the least amount of complications, so that you can prove that the medicine or the treatment that you are trying to get approved is actually going to be beneficial for the patient population. With rare disease populations, we don't have that. First of all, we have very few patients. And we have to find those patients. So first of all, when we have very few, we might have 10 patients across Canada, maybe 60 patients across Canada. But when we start talking about exclusion factors, most of those patients are excluded. My daughter will always be excluded from randomized clinical trials, the way that they are designed nowadays, because one of the things that is always listed as an exclusion factor is something that she has that she cannot get rid of. Like it's not, it is for PAH, atrial septal defects are exclusion factors. If they're unrepaired, they're always an exclusion factor. And she has an atrial septal defect, so she'll never be part of a clinical trial. She'll never get access to drugs earlier through clinical trial, that's never an option for her, which is really sad, because it's always. And then when you have a small patient population, you exclude the same patients all the time, and you exclude any patient. And then the patients maybe that you don't exclude live in the Northwest Territories or in Northern BC, who can't make it to the clinical trial site because you've only got 3 of them across Canada there, and they're all in the big cities. Then you're reducing a very small patient population by exclusion criteria and by location criteria. So, you start with a clinical trial that really sets um, uh, the drug. I'm going to say up for failure, but it reduces the ability of the drug sponsor to prove how beneficial that treatment could be. And the way we get around that, I think, is real world evidence. We do 2 things. We change the way we design clinical trials, and there's a lot of talk out there about adapting or adaptive clinical trials. And I think that's one way of doing it. The other way is obviously adding real world data and real world evidence to the decision making process. That's kind of how, and again, real world data becomes part of the adaptive changing the clinical trial.
Yeah, that's the piece that was incredible when we met and you had such a deep understanding of real world data, at least for your case and for your at least for your daughter's case. Actually, maybe if you could explain to the audience, because let's just imagine there's 6 billion people watching this right now. Not everyone understands what real world data is. Now, from your perspective as a patient advocate, as a parent, what does real world data mean to you? What is real world data? What is real world evidence?
Well, for me, again, I'm going to look at it from the, I think when we talk about real world data and real world evidence right now, it is not something that is in the common vernacular of most patients. We're all patients. Most people, most of us have never heard those words, but in reality, those things are going to affect all of us in the future when precision medicine becomes something that is in the now, right? Because we're going to need that. A common disease that has thousands of people today is going to become more rare as we find out that there are specific things within that common disease, like rare cancers. Now we now have rare cancers. We understand so much more about rare cancers that cancer now is not necessarily a big one big group of people. They're a lot smaller, and the smaller those groups get, the more we're going to need different data to decide whether or not drugs work. And real world evidence and real world data is that. And those are the things that I consider to be. The other thing about real world data and evidence, if we actually knew what that was, it would be so easy to do this. But even like the health technology agencies are trying to determine what real world data is and how to use that data as evidence in clinical trials or in drug approval processes. Because if it, again, they want data that is going to work for that particular product or that particular drug, and not real world data. The same real world data doesn't work for every drug. So there's a lot of work that's going to need to go into whole understanding what data is needed, but it's going to include things like more qualitative data. We're going to have to talk. We're going to have to understand, especially in a rare disease community, things like quality of life, burden of illness, not side effect, the tolerance of side effects, the reduction in symptoms. Like these are important things for rare disease patients more so than maybe common diseases right now. But we also have to look at things like reduction in hospital stays, in lab visits, in doctor visits, caregiver burden. Can your parents, if you have a young child who is has a very devastating rare disease, does it mean one or both parents have to stay at home? Does it mean that they have to pay for caregivers so that they can go out to work? And what does this new treatment for this particular rare disease mean for the family and the community? So it's not just a patient-oriented thing; it's a more societal understanding of the costs associated with that particular disease when we ask ourselves whether or not that drug is effective and how much it should cost. Those are questions we've never had. Health technology agencies have never had to ask or have answered, but they're important. And I think the other real world evidence still comes down to quantitative data. But again, when you talk about rare disease clinical trials, and because you're talking about a very small patient population, we already know that in large clinical trials, that when the drug is approved and it's given out to a larger patient base, we actually find things that benefits that we weren't actually looking for, or we didn't actually think about, or we didn't include in our clinical trial endpoints. So if we can do that with common disease drugs, how can we not think that when we actually open up a clinical trial to more rare disease patients, that we might actually see benefits that we didn't think of before, or that we didn't think were that important, or yeah, that just that or that we can actually, again, direct that treatment to the proper patient. Because when we give it to more patients, we can actually say, well, these patients who have this particular or are within this particular subgroup actually seem to respond better. One of the things that really kills me about idiopathic, we have one of our groups of disease is called idiopathic PAH, which means we really don't understand what the mechanisms are. With in my daughter's case, we understand that she developed PAH because she had this atrial septal defect. That is, if you are more predisposed to PAH, not everybody who has an ASD gets PAH, but you are more predisposed. And there's a whole bunch of scleroderma, some autoimmune diseases. Not everybody who has autoimmune disease gets PAH, but you're more predisposed. And then we have a whole group that says you're idiopathic, which means we have no idea how, but guess which patients are used in clinical trials?
Idiopathic. Yeah.
Are idiopathic patients. So basically, what you're telling me as a patient is my daughter, who you know has these things, is not good for your clinical trial. You're excluding her. But you are including patients who you have no idea what possible confounding factors are going to affect your trial. And yet, these are the people to whom you are giving your trial results to, which, again, it to me it's kind of weird. So basically what we need to do, we need to open up trials again to more rare disease patients. We need to understand basically which subgroups, because I think sometimes we don't really understand our subgroups well enough, as to why we're excluding them, other than it's always been done this way. And so if we understood the subgroups better and we saw how the new treatments worked within those subgroups, we might actually be able to target it better. And that gets us back to real world evidence, real world data, and managed access agreements, and, earlier access through clinical trials and changing clinical trial design.
Yeah, you know what, as I hear it, it's funny because we always put rare disease in its own box and think, it's different than everything else. But a lot of those issues are issues that are in diseases that are commonplace. It's the same issues for clinical trials. It's cherry picking really the healthiest of the sick patients, and then you put it out into the real world and you realize different people react differently, either better or worse. And I won't say people are surprised. We all know that's a consequence of the system that we utilize today for drug approvals. But I think here it just shows that there is a golden opportunity to help these particular patients, and with that, maybe the rest of the drug development pathway as well. So it's almost like we put this artificial wall in place when we're talking about it, but the reality is, numbers aside, it's the same issues, and I think real world data has an opportunity or a role to play in sort of bridging that real world with clinical trials. And I think you raised one of the big ones, which is that ability to get product to patients earlier and continue to learn and continue to identify better subgroups that may have issues, and figure it out as you go, because that's something we don't tend to do until we've decided that this is a safe and effective product and it's on the market and being used broadly.
Yeah, and the reality of it is, yeah, and the reality of it is, with common diseases, even after if you've excluded all of a large patient population because of whatever their confounding factors are, when you do the clinical trial, not everybody responds. You have outliers there too, and if you have outliers in a common disease clinical trial, a clinical trial for a common a drug for common diseases, why would you not expect that to happen with rare diseases? Like, it just, to me, it's like and we talk so much about the fact that there's not enough the evidence is not strong enough in rare diseases. Well, it's not strong enough, obviously, because there's not enough people. But the reality of it is, you were able to throw those outliers out in the common drug review, that particular drug, and because so many other people benefited, but you never really had to ask why they didn't.
Yeah, no, this is this is one area that I know you only like to be introduced with that one sentence, but you do much more than that. You're part of the board of directors at PAH Canada, and then of course you also sit on CADIF's post drug. Was it TROS? Yes,
Drug
exactly.
evaluation.
And one area that you mentioned was around this concept of quality of life, right? Reduction in hospital stays, care impact to the caregiver, impact to society, and of course, I mean, somebody like your daughter. I did not know she was a nationally ranked figure skater, right? Competitive figure skater for Canada. So from that perspective, and I was just doing some of this research yesterday, and it said that someone with pulmonary arterial hypertension, it costs roughly like something around $100,000 per year, right? And
One
yes,
drug.
to say that's one drug, but
She's on
but
3.
as you mentioned, there's so many other things that may not be captured within that overall cost bucket, right? And that's always a question for any public payers. This the clinical benefits versus the cost effectiveness, right? And a lot of times the cost effectiveness may not take into account the other things that you had mentioned, such as quality of life and at least caregiver, like how it impacts the caregivers and the overall society. So since you sit on this CADIF committee, how do you pursue this idea of incorporating those other components into at least their their thought process?
Every chance I get. But the reality of it is, I mean, and Costas, you know this, the post market drug evaluation committee doesn't look. I mean, I'm hoping at some point in time that they do start looking at the post market review of the new drugs. That's what hopefully they will do when we talk about managed access agreements and early approvals, so that we can get early access to drugs and getting the real world evidence from people who are not within the original clinical trial, and using that evidence to give a final approval for the drug. I mean, I'm kind of hoping that that's where the post market drug evaluation group goes, and if not, that there's a branch off of that does that work. But the reality is, I mean, I think Kenneth is doing a lot of good work. I think I mean, they're not doing it. I'm not sure that they're doing it because of rare disease, but they're doing it because the Horizon scan says if we don't get on top of this pretty soon, globally, really, this is precision medicine is coming, and we need to have we have a lot more high cost drugs coming. We have a lot more drugs that are going to be based on or only applicable to very small patient populations, and we have a system that and I don't want to get into qualities, but we have a system that bases the price on something that is completely irrelevant and doesn't work within a rare disease community. I mean, just as a basic, again, I'm just going to put it in basic terms. When you have a drug, when I've said this before, and I don't know if I should actually say it this way, but when the job that you do says, and every time that you approve a drug for a rare disease, and you say, yes, we think this drug should be approved and should be given to this group of people, but we're recommending that the price be reduced by 90%. If every one of your recommendations is suggesting that the price needs to be reduced, I think that you either need to ask yourself, is there something wrong with my methodology, or is there something wrong with the drug? You know what I mean? Like, if everything has to be reduced, then there's something wrong. And so I get that, I get that the idea that a lot of these drugs are going to be very, and there are some real, I mean, you talked about $100,000. In today's terms, that is not an expensive drug. I mean, we have rare disease drugs that will cost $1 million or more a year. And so I do understand I mean, public payers only have a certain amount of dollars to give. And so it's really, it's not an easy decision to decide which drugs get approved and at what price. But the reality of it is, that isn't going to change. and the system we're currently using isn't working. It's not working. You can't ask every drug manufacturer that comes to the table to reduce the cost of that drug by 80 or 90%. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, and I'd say Cadith has they're moving in the right direction, right? I think they've been open to hearing that feedback from the various stakeholders around the table, and I know that they are even looking at setting up or supporting groups to set up registries to start to be able to capture this data, right? So I think they're moving in the right direction. The challenging sort of issue is then how do you take all this data, all this information, and incorporate it into the decision making process to ensure it's fair and balanced. So you're balancing the sort of the public good of delivering that healthcare and access, along with being fiscally responsible. It's not easy. I'm not gonna. I would never say that, but I think they're moving in the right direction. Is sort of been my experience so far with the team that's there.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I mean, they've done some really great things. They've done. We were talking time limited recommendations. We're talking expedited reviews for some drugs. For drugs, actually, as long as the manufacturer actually wants to go down that route, it's actually getting the industry to
Yeah.
use that route rather than they've got it available. It's now pushing the industry to actually use it. And the latest one is their Target Zero initiative, which I think is amazing. But again, the idea is, Cadith and Health Canada have been doing a lot, and there's been a lot of both from like just in so many ways. Again, they have the formulary management committee. I think that's a great a great group. I mean, there's just so many things. I think Cadith has, like you said, the registries. I mean, I think it's important. We didn't talk about patient registries, but where is real world evidence going to reside? A lot of that stuff could be in patient registries. So it's important that you know where those registries are. And then, but it's also important for patient organizations to know what information you want the decision makers want included in the registries, so we can actually do that work for you, so our registry is future
Yeah.
ready. There's a lot of work. They're doing the work, but at the end of the day, it still comes down to funding and access. And we only get access two ways. We get earlier access through clinical trials, or we get earlier access because drugs are approved, are funded in Canada. And we can get them approved in Canada, but when the funding decision still takes another year, for public payers, there's that part of the process still needs
Yeah.
to be fixed.
Speaking about it's a new drug that's coming down the pipeline, right, for PAH. I know something just got approved in the US. FDA just recently approved it, and it seems like it will be coming to Canada hopefully very, very soon. And I'm going to butcher the name of it. You're going to have to help me here, Joan. Is it
So
sotatercept? Okay.
tadrocept.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, and apparently that's the that's the pharmaceutical name. The name that it will be sold under, I think, is Windrevere. But yeah, so it's been approved. It was approved in the U.S. by the FDA on March 26th. It's currently in front of both Health Canada and Cadith under an expedited review, and we're hoping to hear again. I think it'll be. I don't think we're going to have a problem getting the drug approved. I think we're going to have a problem getting the drug funded. Yeah, that's again because it's going to come down to cost. For rare disease drugs, that's really where the issue generally lies is
Yes, and
cost. And because it does, this could my understanding of sotatercept is that it could be the first drug that actually is disease
wow.
reversing, because it actually interrupts certain mechanisms that we know, and it is also, so like I said before, we have a number of drugs on the market already. My daughter's on 3 different types of drugs for 3 different pathways. This is a 4th pathway. This is the first drug on a 4th pathway. So again, it gets back to that complexity of this disease. And so the reality of it is, if you look at something like sotatercept, sometimes you can take away other stuff when you get something new. But we're talking about a disease where we now have 4 different pathways. How do you take away one drug without knowing that the drug that you're replacing it with, because they are 2 different mechanisms, 2 different pathways. So we're not just asking, we can't go to Health Canada or CADIF and go, yeah, but you know what, this old drug can be removed because we've had it for 20 years and this is the one that's going to change things. It could be, but until we do clinical trials to see, we have to stay with we can't take patients off of drugs until we know that it's safe for them to come off those drugs.
Got it. And thanks for helping me out with that little bit of a word scramble there. But for sotatercept, I assume that your group at least by your group I mean PAH Canada has done probably I assume a lot of work. And maybe if you can walk us through sort of the type of work that you've been doing to make sure that patients hopefully get access to this, it seems like first-in-class therapy that hopefully is even reversing the actual disease itself completely. Maybe if you can walk us through some of the efforts that you have, especially your team has already made to get it this far.
Well, actually, there's nothing that, as an organization, there's nothing that a patient organization can do until the drug is approved in Canada, right? Like we can keep like basically what we're doing right now is keeping our fingers crossed and hoping that the drug will be approved. And then once it's approved, then we will go out and advocate to get that drug available to Canadians across this country and to available as many as many Canadians with PAH obviously as possible. Because I don't know if our listeners understand how the funding process works, but in Canada, when a drug gets approved, CADIF, that recommendation from CADIF goes to what's called PCPA, which is the representative organization that represents all public payers across Canada. And they work with the manufacturer to come up with a price, a negotiated price that drug will be sold in Canada. And then once that is done, and that can take months, but once that is done, the manufacturer still has to go to every single individual payer province and get them to put the drug on their formulary. And so we could get an approval for sotatercept from, I have no idea when, maybe a couple of months, maybe 5 months from CADIF within the year, but we could wait another year before it's actually available to anybody who needs access through a public drug plan. And so that is where patient organizations come in. I mean, if you have access, again, we're talking a lot of times patient organizations talk about equitable access, because if you have access to private health insurance, you generally get access to those drugs sooner, as long as they're willing to put them on their formulary. And they generally do that well before any negotiation through with the PCPA. But anybody who doesn't have access to a public drug plan, a private drug plan, has to wait for public access. And that literally can take well over a year. But that's where patient organizations get involved. We try and get people across the country to talk to their MPs, to work to make them understand how important this particular drug might be to them, and ask them to look into getting it funded on their formulary. The drugs that we currently have for PAH are not available to all patients across Canada. There are still some public formularies that do not carry all of the drugs. So it kind of is sad. We talk a lot about a thing called postal code lottery, which means it really does depend where you live in this country sometimes when you can get access to drugs. And so that's another way we need to improve getting earlier access to drugs, is trying to improve that system so that if you live in Ontario, whether you live in Ontario or Alberta or BC or PEI, you can get access to the drug at the same time. And that, I think that's part of the direction of the national strategy for rare diseases, or to improve access to drugs. How successful that will be is still to be determined.
Joan, not to put you on the spot, but do you think that's a role that National Pharmacare, if it ever actually materializes, should be taking on head on, is to ensuring that for rare disease there's equitable access across Canada?
I think I think that's what the goal is. Whether it's I mean, I have my own ideas of how I think that needs to to play out. And it's interesting that even within the rare disease community, we don't agree on what that looks like. But there's a lot of things that can go wrong with this too, and I think when you have a national, I like national pharmacare. I like the thought of it. I like the very basic idea that it doesn't matter where you live in Canada, you can get access to the drug. The problem is that formulary is not going to cover all rare disease drugs, first of all, and secondly, I ask myself, and I ask others, is this just an opportunity for other people not to pay their fair share because they go, well, you know what, we don't have to do it here in the province because they're going to do it nationally. So I think we have a system that really makes it difficult for things to actually get solved quickly, which is what we keep fighting for.
Yes. Yeah, no, good on you guys for keep fighting on the good fight. But actually, on that, not to be on a pessimistic mood here, but when you said, I'm just doing the math here a little bit, and it's rare disease just by the nature of it is rare. That means very, very few people. And you had mentioned that as a patient advocacy group, you once the drug gets to a certain point, it's approved by Health Canada, right? Then you ask the advocates to send letters to MPs. But if the definition is that there's very few of the people, that means there should be very few letters that go to these MPs from your community. And I'm sure they get millions of letters from. I mean, they wrestle with not just health issues, but obviously other societal issues that they need to deal with as well. So how do you get them to listen? I guess is in like it's almost. I guess what I'm asking is, what is almost the mechanics of a patient advocacy group like yourselves? Like, how do you get people to listen? How do you get people, that to prioritize sort of your voice?
Well, I think part of the advocacy is making people understand that there is rare disease, right? I mean, the reality of it is we don't talk about rare disease, and we don't have a voice, and that's why I really think it's important too. And I have been going to CORD meetings and CORD events since 2014 when my daughter was diagnosed, because you're right, as individual organizations with very small patient populations, we can get lost in the weeds. They don't have to do very much without getting great upset in the public, because there's so few of us to actually to yell and scream. But when you work as a group of patient organizations or communities, rare disease communities, you come at it with a louder voice. And so for me, that's why it's been really important for me to not just focus on my community, but on the rare disease community, because I think the only way we tackle this issue is to provide a united voice nationally and from a larger population base. Because the other thing, I think the number is 1 in 12 people in Canada will be diagnosed with a rare disease. So when you talk about what rare is, a rare disease is rare, but rare is actually not rare. Right. And so, yeah, it's not as rare. We just need to make decision makers aware of the fact that and when something is not rare, you think of it as one big common disease. And then you go, well, look at the societal impacts, the cost to society, the cost to the healthcare system, all of those costs. So if we look at what we can, again, at a bigger picture of what some of this stuff is going to could do in reducing costs in other areas, then maybe we might actually start to think of this as, instead of cost effective, it's an investment.
I really like that. I haven't heard that sort of analogy before, but I think it makes a lot of sense when you start pulling these rare diseases together. It's no longer rare, and it's no longer a minimal cost or a minimal impact to the Canadian health system. So I think it's a terrific way to start to sort of have a different perspective on what is really rare and what the definition is.
From your ears to the decision makers, Costas.
We'll do what we can.
And I know we quickly went over a couple of things, and one of the things was you mentioned the word CORD, which is an acronym, right? It stands for the, what was it, the Canadian Organization.
Canadian Organization of Rare Disorders.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, that's a very much appreciated. And I know we're running up against 15 minutes already. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. Our producers always say that we run a little bit long, but these conversations are always so fascinating. So maybe we'll have like one last question and then we'll wrap things up. So Costas, do you want to end things off, given this is your first time back from your vacation?
So you know what? Thanks for giving me the last question here. I think for me the in a perfect world, you'd want to see these products uh, come to market quickly, get access quickly. That's our goal. For you, in the next couple of years, what do you think we need to do to try to get there? What if there's one or two things that you would want to see changed? What would those be?
Um, that's hard because for me, it's the funding piece is a
Hmm.
real stickler. I don't know how we fix it, but I think that we need like significant, you know, like a mindset change as to how we deal with funding of drugs now, rare disease drugs, but eventually all drugs. Um, I'd like to see something happen, funding decisions happen sooner. I'd like to see, how maybe use more managed access agreements for some of these things, understand, put them out there, allow them to work or not work, and make decisions that way. But I also think we need to change clinical trials for rare diseases. We really need to, and all the stakeholders, in order for that to happen, all the stakeholders who are part of that process need to be part of understanding the change. And that includes patients. I mean, our organization really talks a lot about getting patients involved, right? Even from the research. Like if you involve patients in understanding, asking patients what's important to them at the research stage. What are the things that you want to see? What's important to you? Is it quality of life things? Is it symptom reduction? What are the things that are important to you? And then use that data to determine your research objectives. I think I think maybe including patients more across the spectrum of drug development and approval, including research and funding. I mean, the one place that we still do not see patients is at
Yeah.
the funding table.
I think that would be a sea change for decision making in Canada if we can get
Yeah.
those three things all in place.
Yeah.
Well, and
Yeah.
globally, right? I mean, this is not a Canada-wide problem. It's a global issue. And I think the other thing that we can learn really well, or that we should be learning, is that what is good for Europe or what is good for the United States in terms of making decisions, we shouldn't have to
Yeah.
reinvent the wheel. We can make decisions quicker if we use information that other people or other health technology assessment organizations have already used. There's so many things we can
And
do.
I lied. I'm going to ask another question. Sorry, it's a little bit of a comment, but also a question because you mentioned this a couple of times, and we kind of just skimmed over it. But you mentioned managed access multiple times, so maybe if you can just explain what that means and why is there an opportunity in this so-called managed access, and maybe compare it to what the traditional access would be.
I know, and I apologize because this conversation about real world evidence, it's not small because it impacts so many different things, right? And one of the things that it does impact, or that it is managed access agreements, and basically the way we do funding right now is we say, okay, the drug is approved, and this is what we're going to pay for it, and you've got it, and we're approving it based on the evidence that we saw in clinical trials. Managed access agreements work differently in that they say, okay, we didn't see the kind of evidence that we thought that we needed to see to make a final recommendation, but we think it has potential. So we are going to say, yes, you can give this drug to more patients outside of the clinical trial, or you can give patients access to patients outside the clinical trial, but we're going to ask that you um, collect and gather more information from all of these patients. And based on that information, we will decide, we will make a final recommendation somewhere down the road, a prearranged time down the road, as to who actually benefits from that drug and how much we're willing to pay for it. So we're managing access to the drug based on additional evidence that is provided after the clinical trial is completed. Have I got that right, Costas?
That's perfect.
So it just seems like your wish, if I could summarize that, would be you would like people to say yes more. Would that be fair?
I would like them to say yes
That's
sooner.
good. That's good. They should watch that Jim Carrey movie.
Earlier.
You know, there's a Jim Carrey movie called Yes Man. You need to send that over to them.
No.
But on that note, thanks a lot, Joan, for being on the podcast. This is a wonderful conversation, and just that you've been doing such wonderful work. Well, not just yourself, but your community has been doing such wonderful work, and the rest of the rare disease community, I'm sure, thanks you. And the rare disease community obviously needs advocates like yourself, and your daughter obviously needs having a caring parent like yourself that loves her and really supports not just her, but the overall the community itself. I think is something that very, very lucky to have. So thank you very much, Joan, for being on the podcast. Any actually last words? Actually, where can people find you if they wanted to see your work? Do you have a Twitter or?
No, I stay off of all of that stuff. I'm not accessible, unfortunately. But I just wanted to say, I really do. I think, Lester, when you originally broached this with me, I said, "Oh no, I can't do a podcast. I don't want to do it. I've never done this before. I'm not sure I'm going to be very good." And I honestly, hopefully, this has been, for me, it was better than I expected from my perspective. Like from what I really appreciate the fact, given the opportunity to provide the information that I did. I hope it helps people. But yeah, it's given me. It also, it's for me. It was a learning experience, and I come away with it from it with a little bit more confidence that I can actually do this.
So I just quickly looked it up on online. So if you do want more information about Pulmonary Hypertension Association of Canada, that's where you're part of the board of directors. You can go to PHA Canada, CANADA.ca for more information. And again, thank you very much, Joan, for jumping on this podcast. If you like this conversation, please subscribe, like this podcast. And of course, if you have any questions, you can feel free to comment below. So again, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you, Joan, for coming on.
Thanks, Joan.
And no, thank you for doing that, though, Lester, because those are the things I always forget.
No worries. I got you.
No worries.
Okay.
Thank you.